So today we are beginning a new book of the Torah. Thank you. And that book is Shemot. We are in Parsha Shemot, and really what it speaks about is exile, is galut, exile. And so what we're going to talk about are the concepts of exile and redemption. So the first section of the book of Exodus of Shemot opens, and it's interesting that it's called Exodus, going out. So really going in to go out. That's a lot of what we're talking about today. So this first book of Exodus opens by listing the names called Shemot, in Hebrew the Parsha is called Shemot, of Jacob's sons, and then chronicles the growth of their descendants into a nation. They go from being a family, tribes, a nation, and we see this here in this Parsha, and then their enslavement in Egypt. So as the conditions of slavery progressively worsen, it's really terrible, the Jews cry out to God. And then God charges Moshe, with the mission of freeing the Jewish people from slavery in order to go out and receive the Torah. And God informs them that the purpose of their redemption is so they could assume their role as the moral leaders of humanity, steering the world toward its divine fulfillment as God's true home. So this is our job through the morality that Torah tells us is the morality, which is God's morality that he's teaching us. And then that we, through our work, the world will know that God is here and this world is God's true home. So this is a process. The Jews' physical exile was their forced slavery, and their spiritual exile was their psychological enslavement to the host's culture. You have to remember that the Egyptians were they were idol worshipers. What they did was not okay. I mean, we see the Pharaoh decided he had to take baths in the blood of babies. What kind of culture is this? But of course, they wanted everyone to fit into their culture. Although many Jews did assimilate because of their exile, others struggled to retain their Jewish identity, refusing to give up their Jewish names and language because of their faith in their destiny. It's very important to know that our faith in our destiny gives us the strength to keep going as a Jewish people.
Our faith and or faith in?
Our faith in. Okay, our faith in God and our faith in our purpose. So it was only after revealing their identity in response to the challenge of exile that the Jewish people could receive the Torah. So that in exile, when we come through by recognize our inner identity, which is our soul identity as Jews, then we're able to go out of exile. So the purpose of the Torah is to teach us how to bring divine consciousness even into the most mundane aspects of life, even those that initially oppose godliness. So in exile, the Jewish people learned how to overcome even these forces. So that is always the question: how do I live in the way that God wants me to live now in this situation? The same applies to our present exile, holding on tenaciously to our traditions, even those that appear to be unimportant, will bring our redemption more quickly. So that's like holding on to God. And we're going to see that in this particular parsha, we see this very clearly. So the challenges that we overcome prepare us for the exalted divine revelations that will accompany the imminent final redemption. So I have to understand, what does that mean, final redemption? What does it mean? there are going to be revelations of God. God's going to let us know who he is, and God's going to let us know that he's here. So now in this Parsha, the people go into exile. So Pharaoh gave orders to all his people, you must cast every boy who was born into the Nile, but you must let every girl live. What does that mean? Instructing the people to let every girl live, Pharaoh meant that the Jewish girls should be raised as Egyptians. So they wanted to either get rid of the people by killing the boys or by getting the girls so involved in their culture that they forget who they are, which is basically the same thing on a spiritual level. So by instructing the people to let every girl live, that's what he wanted. They should all be raised as Egyptians. So he thus decreed that the boys should be killed physically and the girls spiritually. And the Egyptians murdered children in terrible ways and did what they could to weaken every person. Now, Egypt, Mitzrayim, is the prototype of all exiles. In all exiles, the ruling culture urges us to raise our children in its ways, promising that this is the path to attain material and social success. Just fit in. As in Egypt, resisting these promises and ensuring that our children grow up cherishing the Torah's values is what will guarantee their material, social, and spiritual happiness, as well as their freedom from the bonds of exile. When we face obstacles in fulfilling our divine mission, we should realize that we can earn God's helpful intervention by trusting that he will help us. That's what we're going to talk about now, that God is here. And that when we do our part, God helps us. This is very, very important to know. Otherwise, people feel very alone. So feeling confident of God's help does not mean that we shouldn't take natural steps to solve our problems, but it means that we could trust God to crown our efforts with success. So we have to do our part and trust that God will take care of the rest. Now, our sages teach us that it was in the merit of their confidence in God that the Jews were delivered from Egypt. Similarly, our confidence that God will reveal us from the present exile will itself hasten the redemption. Now, in this first exile, the suffering became so terrible that the people cried out, and then the quote is, God heard their moaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. Very interesting that the crying out made a difference. Obviously, God is there the whole time, but in the people's crying out, they reached out, and they just reached out to God, and God responded. This is very important to know. And of course, this is something that we always have to do, is talk to God, pray to God, ask for God's help and presence. Right after this, the Torah tells that Moses was shepherding the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law. So right here, right after it says God saw and God knew, things change. And this is important to know. Just one moment. To this, okay. So they cry out, God remembered the covenant, God sees them, and God knew. Now, to know, what do you think? God didn't know. God knew. But know from the word da'at means to focus, that's where you focus. So God now focuses. They cried out, God focuses. And right after this, the Torah tells that Moses was shepherding the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law. And it says, again, quote, he arrived at the mountain of God. Now, this is Mount Sinai. However, God brought him to this place. And there, Moses had his first prophetic vision when he saw the burning bush, burning in fire, but not consumed by fire. So that's obviously something that's very paradoxical, doesn't make sense. If it's burning in fire, it gets burned by fire. But here it burned, but didn't get burnt. So it's something that Moses wanted to see what this was. And he turned toward the bush. And God called out to him from the bush, Moshe, Moshe. And he replied, Hineni. God called out to him with his name, Moses, Moses, which is an endearing sign. And he answered, Hineni, I'm here. In other words, you're calling me, I'm here for you. When God called upon him to accept the incredible task of leading the Jewish people from slavery to liberation, so God, that's what God told him in this vision. I want you to go take the people out. And he was, what to do with that? That seemed like a rather tall order. Get the people out of slavery, take them out of Egypt. How could I do that? So he hesitated. And he said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? He asked. And the answer was, for I will be with you. God reassured him. Moses could not go alone. God would be with him every step of the way. That's very important to know, that whatever we're doing, when we're doing something that is something we feel is for God's purpose, that God is with us. Very, very important. So Moses understood that before he could even try to influence Pharaoh, he first had to influence the Jewish people. So he had to impress on them that God, the God of their fathers, was about to take them out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. With a strong hand and an outstretched arm means God's going to do it, and God's going to do miracles. God's got this. But he also had to do something. Moses had to be the person who does something to make the people aware and get the people ready. And he sensed, and we talk about Moses as the person who strengthens the faith of the Jews, that he was a shepherd, and we say, Raya Mehemna, that he was a shepherd of faith, because he's going to bring the Jews to the faith. This is going to happen. Get yourself ready. We're going to be going. So he sensed that this task would not be so easy to inspire them to believe in the imminent redemption. And Moses said, quote, before I come to the children of Israel and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they will say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? So what does that mean? Moses understood that on hearing that the Lord, that the God of their fathers was about to redeem them, the first question, what does it mean? What is his name? What's that question? So God has assorted names. First of all, God is beyond all names. That's what, first of all, God is beyond names. But when we talk about God and relating to God and how God relates to the world, there are names that represent various ways in which he expresses himself. There's a name of kindness, there's a name of judgment, there's a name of compassion. We speak about each of God's name fitting into a method of, so God's name, which is Kale, that has to do with love, that means that he's relating with love. So they really want to, what's going on with God? And Moses knew that the Jews could immediately ask, and what were they really asking? How did God behave in a way that caused us to suffer so terribly and for so many decades? So they really want to understand, how could God do this? When they're saying, what is his name? It's like, how could God do this? Where's God coming from? What is his name? What is the name, the attribute, the justification for God to be silent in the face of such terrible human suffering? And Moses realized that before the Jews could accept God's promise for redemption, they must first understand how and why he allowed their suffering. And God said to Moses in response to this, Echia asher echia. I will be what I will be. And so he said, so shall you say to the children of Israel, Echia, I will be, has sent me to you. What's the meaning of the name Echia? I will be what I will be. And how does it address the question, which name would allow for so much Jewish suffering? And Rashi explains, Echia asher echia, I will be what I will be, means I will be with them in this predicament. I will be with them in this predicament, what I will be with them in their subjugation to other kingdoms. In this, God tells the people that there will be other exiles and redemptions. Only after the entire cycle of exiles until the true redemption will we be able to understand the infinite God. Somewhere down the line in the future, God will make himself known to us, and only then will we come to really know him and his inscrutable ways. I shall be what I shall be. According to Rashi, God explained to Moses that the question of how he allows so much suffering is a powerful question, but it's not a question that we need to answer. Instead, Moses had to bring the people a far more powerful insight that God is with us in our suffering, that he has not abandoned us, that he is present even when his presence is hidden. We have survived so much pain and suffering throughout our history, not because we had a philosophical explanation about how God allows such suffering, but because we sensed we were never alone. That is the message that God is saying to give to the people, that to explain to you what this whole cycle of exile and redemption and what you get from the exile and redemption. So far, we talked about that in exile, we're meant to live as Jews and keep living in the way God wants us to live, no matter what's going on. And in that way, we elevate the world. But to explain why God is doing this in this whole way, that will be seen later on. Sometimes we have experiences like that where we say, why is this taking me so long? And then it turned out that we had to meet somebody that was going to give us a piece of key information before we got the project completed. So we realized that we have been unhappy. It's taking me so long. Why is it taking me so long? Why is it taking me so long? And then we meet the person, and then things become a lot clearer, and then we can go forward. So sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. But the message that God is giving to Moshe to tell the people is basically, I'm here for you. I am with you. And that's what we need to know. God is with us. Each of us, like Moses, are sometimes called on to comfort someone who's suffering. And perhaps the lesson is that we don't have to explain or blame. The most important thing we can do is to simply be present and help the person feel that he or she is not alone. It's very, very strong. It's actually very interesting that when a close person of a family passes away and you go to visit them, a shiva visit, there's a law, halacha, that you don't say anything. You just go there and you sit there because your presence comforts them. Then if they want to talk to you, they'll say something to you. So you see very often people say things that they don't need to say, like, thank you for coming. But what they really mean is, I'm opening the conversation and I'm glad you're here. And then they may choose to speak, or they may choose to be silent. But here, God is saying to Moshe, there's no explanation right now, but you need to know that I'm here with you, no matter what. So through galut, through exile, by definition, this is a time when God's presence in our lives isn't manifest and palpable as it was and will soon be again. It doesn't mean that we don't have our relationship with him. So we need to know, each of us, that we have a relationship with God. And this idea was expressed by Jacob the first time that our nation was sent into exile, when he informed his children that they would spend many years exiled in Egypt. But God will be with you. So God is omnipresent. He's with everyone all the time. So Jacob's special assurance that God would be with all the Jews was referring to God's overt presence and protection. Though our exiles have been times of great national difficulty, persecution, and worse, God has made our small displaced nation outlive all the superpowers that have tried to annihilate her. That's only because God is with us and God does miracles. So we don't either always understand why God is doing what he's doing, the miracles, but he's with us. And that's why he's doing it, because he knows what he wants. And in Tehillim, in Psalm 91:15, it quotes God as saying, I am with Israel. I am with him in distress. So this was the message that God conveyed by choosing to appear to Moshe in a thorn bush when the Jews were being oppressed by the Egyptians. Now the sages learn, they explain, we learn that the divine presence resides among Israel, as it were, in all the misery of their exile. And when they are redeemed, he too will return with them. So no matter what is going on, God is with the Jewish people. And it's at the thorn bush for the first exile, in this first exile, that God sends the message to the people to know that he is with them. Part of the message, Moshe was very hesitant to say this, I don't know if he actually said it, is there are going to be other exiles too. So, and by the way, all exiles are called Egypt, because that first exile was the beginning of a cycle of exiles and redemption. And then there's Yetziat Mitzrayim, that we go out of Egypt, that we go out of exile altogether. So the book of Bereshit, Genesis, deals with the stories of the nation's patriarchs and matriarchs, beginning with Avram, continuing with Yitzhak, and ending with Yaakov and his sons. And Genesis, which we just finished reading this first book, tells the story of the individuals who developed a family dedicated to the one God. But now we have begun Exodus. And from Exodus onward, the narrative is on a much larger scale. It's the narrative of the Jewish people as a whole. Now, the major narrative of the book of Exodus is undoubtedly the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the experience of exile and the process of leaving it. And the exile, the Exodus, the exile means going out toward the, in other words, getting stuck in there is for the purpose of going out. Going in is for going out. And the Exodus is a central theme, not only in the book of Exodus, but in Jewish life in general. Our prayer book, the Siddur, shows that we mention the Exodus on festivals and on every Shabbat. The Egyptian exile and the Exodus are more than the specific historical narrative that appears in the book of Exodus. They are basic elements within our being. The exile and the redemption in Exodus were not a one-time event. but merely the paradigm for an event that recurs again and again throughout our history. Exile, followed by redemption, followed by exile again. And through this, the metamorphosis of the Jewish people continues. We go through this cycle in the course of our individual lives. In our own personal lives, there's a stage of exile, of difficulties and problems, followed by a stage of redemption, of bursting through the difficulties and the problems, and the cycle continues. So we have this in our own personal lives. The cycle of the Egyptian exile and the Exodus is the prototype for this central pattern that we continue to experience both as a community and as individuals in a variety of forms. Our world is built on the reality of exile, a complex existence with problems and difficulties. And in the middle of exile, we have to endeavor to ultimately attain redemption. So we have to not get stuck in thinking exile thoughts. We have to think geula, redemption thoughts. One of the things, the word gola, which is exile, and geula, which is redemption, are spelled exactly the same, except that geula, redemption, has an aleph in it. Aleph is the first letter. It means one, but it also means the one God. So that we have to bring the one God into our perception, into our mentality, and then we live in redemption. So there are several stages to the Egyptian exile. The people of Israel settle in Egypt over a long period, and not all this period is considered exile. Certainly not in the true sense. Jacob and his family traveled to Egypt willingly and for their own good. Remember, they went to Egypt because there was a famine and they needed to go there. And Joseph, one of the sons, one of the tribes, he was in charge. And he said, come, I'll take good care of you. And it was good for some time. When then does their existence become one of exile? What's the dividing line? So it appears that the oppression of the Egyptian exile begins only when Pharaoh says to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too numerous and strong for us. The beginning of the Egyptian exile began with the Egyptians' perception that Israel is a foreign nation, and they sense Israel's foreignness. As long as this awareness is lacking and the Egyptians relate to the people of Israel as individuals, this is not yet exile. The people of Israel are just strangers. Exile hinges on whether the person is part of a collective or a separate individual. When individuals, even a large number of them, are in a country, they may be considered foreigners, strangers in a strange land. But when there is a collective, an entire nation in a place that's inappropriate for it, that is exile. Because of this, Jews in exile often try to solve what seems like the problem by trying to ignore their collective identity. They may hide their Jewishness. That keeps them looking at themselves as individuals. Even in the reality of Egyptian bondage, there were Jews who tried this. So you imagine a Jew living in Egypt who's suddenly forced into slavery and ordered to work with mortar and bricks. So if he's part of the collective, he looks at it in a certain way. But if not, if he sees himself as an individual, the first thing he thinks of is how to advance in rank, how to be part of that society, how to fit in, how to be appointed as a foreman and not merely a regular worker. After becoming a foreman, he continues to rise in rank, becoming a taskmaster. And then he rises further in the ranks until he finds a more desirable position. This Jew sees the problem as a personal one, a problem connected to his place and his personal situation, and he relates to the problem correspondingly. A person who relates to himself strictly as an individual will never leave Egypt, because basically he's trying to fit into Egypt. And the better he fits into Egypt, the more he actually loses the individuality of who he is, but the more he fits in, so he thinks. Only a person who is aware of his situation, who understands that he is in exile, has a chance of leaving it for the good and spacious land. These two states, exile and redemption, go together. They are interconnected. It's a person's awareness that he's in exile that creates the opening through which he may emerge from that exile and attain redemption. So long as one accepts as a given the framework of the existing reality, thinking, well, it is the way it is, what could you do? Then he will never be able to recognize the possibility of redemption. Only when a person comes to the realization that he lives in exile, that the situation is fundamentally out of order, that this is a mess, this is wrong, this is not okay. Only then can he begin to discuss redemption, an essential change in the reality. The existence of exile and the possibility of attaining redemption are bound up with the fundamental question of how the individual views the reality of his life. The moment a person comes to the awareness that his reality is not as it should be, it's not okay, and that it has to be changed on an essential level, that's the moment when he can begin the process of redemption. So he has to say, this is not okay. What is going on here is wrong, and it's not okay. Then he can begin to think redemption. Otherwise, he keeps trying to fit in. This person is trying to be a taskmaster while the Pharaoh is bathing in the blood of Jewish babies. He doesn't get what's going on. He's just thinking about himself. How do I move forward? Because that's what it is. So we have to not get stuck in that's what it is. We have to recognize that it has to change. Then we begin to live with the mentality of geula within the galut, of redemption within the exile. We stop identifying with the mentality of exile and begin to recognize that God is with us and we are on the way to redemption. Even within the present situation, we move forward with redemption consciousness, with geula consciousness, knowing that God is with us and knowing that God's taking us out. But we have to have that in our own minds, the redemption consciousness, even within exile. So we live with this ebb and flow of one of the most important tides of Mitzrayim and geula, of bondage and redemption. This concept is so important that we mention it every day. Mitzrayim, although translated in English as Egypt, in Hebrew connotes bondage, enclosure, crushed by rigid boundaries. Redemption is described as our exodus from there. Apart from being the name of a place, Mitzrayim refers to the state of a Jew in exile. Chassidus teaches that a Jew has to tune in to what is happening to himself on a daily basis. So we have to look at where we are. Are we in an exile mentality? Are we in a redemption mentality? What's our reality? And one of the things that is happening in the process of exile and redemption is that we look to see where we are. So exile and redemption refers to a time in Jewish life where a Jew finds himself boxed in or trapped. There is then a process by which a Jew can escape that bondage, an exodus from the state of spiritual, mental, and physical servitude. The exodus, as it is called, is a process which goes on every day. The process is reflected in Torah in a series of events, and those events, although they actually happened in history, keep happening until the final redemption that will be the final entry into the land of Israel with Mashiach. We saw in a past Parsha that when Jacob was with his father-in-law, with Lavan, he could have felt trapped. Lavan was constantly playing around with his head and with his property and gave him not the wife he wanted, a different wife, and all kinds of things. But he stayed connected to God. He knew that he lived in God's presence. Remember, that was the message that Moses was given by God. Ekia asher ekia, I will be who I will be, which means I am who I am, and I'm with you and I will be with you. And because Yaakov knew that God was with him, he kept acting as a Jew. He kept doing his part in serving God, and he knew that God would take him out, which he did. At a deeper level, the process of exile into redemption from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, into the desert, God, as we will see in the next parshas, takes the Jews out of Egypt and brings them to the desert, was repeated as exile into redemption to the desert, then from the desert to Israel, then exile from the redemption back to Israel at the time of the first and then the second temple, and the present exile, and soon the final redemption. This has been our pattern, and within that pattern are a series of similar sequences. The more particular, smaller patterns belong to every Jew every day of his life. Our own personal experiences of inner or outer exile and inner or outer liberation. That we start our day saying, Moda Ani, thank you for returning my soul to me, is a liberation. And we start our day, sometimes we feel we're in exile. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle a situation. And then we say, okay, God is with me. What good would God like me to do? What can I do? What will bring me forward in a positive way, knowing that I can do my part and God will help me and it will be good? This brings us through our own daily process. So the descent into Egypt, Egyptian exile, is connected to the redemption from Egypt. And is also connected with the future redemption until the ultimate redemption with Mashiach. Going into an exile has to do with going into redemption. So if a person sees, for example, it was raining a leak, that feels like an exile. Drip, drip onto my bed. That's not good. But that brings us to say, what can I do to fix it? Can I find somebody who will fix it for me? And then it's better than it was before, because the fact that it was able to leak meant that there was a problem. And then we're out of it. Now we have a better roof. Then we need to paint the ceiling. But that's better than it was before. And keep going forward. So we have to know that since the beginning, since the first exile, God is bringing us through a process which will bring us to the ultimate redemption. The descent into exile and its tribulations are actually part of the redemption, even of the final redemption. So we have to know that we're in the process. It feels sometimes like that this exile, like that you're stuck in and it's going to go on forever. But we have to know that it's part of a process. And as God has taken us out of Egypt, out of the first exile, we are now being taken out of exile, even though it doesn't feel that way. And the recognition that God was with them, even in their suffering, is how their faith grew stronger. And our faith is meant to go stronger all the time. Through the exodus from Egypt, the people left slavery and became free individuals for all eternity. That's something, I hope that we'll talk about that another time. When God took us out of slavery to redemption, he also took us out of the mentality of slavery. We do not have slave mentality. We know that God is with us always, and that God is taking us out of Egypt always. That we have to do our part, but that God is with us always. And we're always free people, no matter what's going on. Through the exodus from Egypt, the people left, became free individuals for all eternity. And we mention the exodus every day. And we say, it says it in Pesachim, in every generation and every day, one is obligated to view himself as if he left Egypt today. So we need to have this mentality every day, all the time, that we were taken out of exile. We are free. And this is who we are. God's intention, as he told Moses, was to bring the people to Mount Sinai to receive God's Torah. There, God was teaching the people how to keep both our individual and national consciousness of true freedom, of redemption, because we have to be part of the whole, but each of us has our individual aspects, mitzvot, that we are meant to do, and the Torah teaches us how. And this leads us to the ultimate redemption with the awareness of God's revelation. Even while we're still in exile, we are free to choose God and our godly purpose in the world. And may we experience true redemption and revelation, and there will be another leader who will come, called Mashiach, anointed, a descendant of King David, who, like Moses, came with a message and guided the people. We will have Mashiach. May we experience the true redemption and revelation, and may then the whole world will recognize God's presence in the world. And that is the aim, that the whole world should know God's presence. And may that be now.